Before we begin the video, please head on over to Patreon, linked in the description below, where you can help support the channel and request content to be made. Thank you very much. And now, a passage from A Concise History of New Mexico, from Chapter 19, The American Occupation. The commencement of a war between Mexico and the United States naturally caused great concern and excitement in New Mexico, not only because a part of the soil was directly in controversy as being within the boundaries claimed by Texas, but also because the news of the commencement of hostilities at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma in May 1846 was almost immediately followed by information that an expedition was being fitted out in Missouri for an attack on Santa Fe. This was the American Army of the West, which was ordered to rendezvous at Fort Leavenworth under General Stephen W. Kearny for the conquest of New Mexico and California. This army was composed of the 1st Dragoons, USA, of which Kearny was a colonel, a Missouri regiment under Colonel Doniphan, a battery of light artillery commanded by Major Clark, 2 companies of infantry, and the Laclede Rangers of St. Louis, the whole together comprising 1,658 men and 16 pieces of ordnance. Although intended to meet at Fort Leavenworth, the different parts of the little army did not really come together until they had crossed the plains and arrived at Bent's Fort, near the present village of Las Animas, and then the great rendezvous for Western traders, at which point they found no less than 414 loaded wagons awaiting protection. From here, a small detachment was sent to the Taos Valley to ascertain the disposition of the people, the main body going on by way of the Raton Pass. The Taos party rejoined the army near the Boñil with 14 prisoners, and bringing the news that 5,000 of the Pueblos and other Indians had joined the Mexicans, who were determined to contest the entire route from San Miguel to Santa Fe. The first habitations seen were on the banks of the Mora on the ranch of James Bonney, who had recently settled there and who treated the officers with much hospitality. On August 15th, the army entered Las Vegas, then a comparatively new and small town, and here stopped long enough for the general to make a proclamation of pacific intentions towards the people and to administer the oath of allegiance of the United States to the alcalde, Juan de Dios Mace, who was then confirmed in his office. Tecolote was the next town reached, and here similar proceedings were had as well as at San Miguel, then the county seat and principal town of the portion of New Mexico east of the mountains, on the next day. Meanwhile, General Armijo, the Mexican governor, after issuing a stirring proclamation calling on the people to rise and defend their homes, had marched from Santa Fe to the narrow pass at Cañoncito, where he had encamped in an almost impregnable location to prevent the passage of the American army. So strong was the position that Kearny did not think of attacking it directly, but had arranged to take a circuitous route which would carry him around it without great danger, and encamped near the ruins of Pecos, with that intent on the night of August 17th. But during the night, the Mexican army, largely made up of inexperienced volunteers, poorly armed, had heard such exaggerated accounts of the force of the Americans that it became demoralized. Many left for their homes, and Armijo, after a council of war with his chief officers, concluded to retire with those who remained faithful to him toward the south. So the Americans, instead of a mountain trail, found the main road open, and proceeded toward the capital unembarrassed, except by the breastwork of trees that had been thrown across the canyon. Wishing, if possible, to reach there in one day, especially as their provisions were almost exhausted, they made a forced march and arrived at Santa Fe before nightfall, raising the stars and stripes over the palace, and then retiring to the high ground in the southeast part of the town for a camp. This was on August 18th. General Kearny and several officers came a little in advance and were received at the palace by the secretary and acting governor, Juan Bautista Vigil, who formally delivered to them the government of the city. Few marches in American history exceed in daring that of the little Army of the West across the plains. Consisting of less than 2 regiments of men, it marched 900 miles from its base of supplies, largely through a desert region, not seeing a habitation except Bent's Fort between Leavenworth and the Mora River, suffering greatly from lack of water, and with neither provisions nor money sufficient to procure them for so long a march. During the last part of the journey, they were reduced to 1/3 rations, and even with this small allowance, only enough remained for the least number of days possible to reach Santa Fe by rapid and uninterrupted marching so that they arrived at the capital entirely destitute. Even here, their privations were not at an end, for the commissary was without money, and the people, having been declared citizens of the United States, and therefore fully protected, no property could be taken without cash payment. The first business of General Kearny after taking possession of Santa Fe was to commence the building of Fort Marcy, on the heights overlooking the city, in order to secure the fruits of his bloodless victory, and then to establish a provisional government. On the morning of the 19th, he assembled the people in the plaza and addressed them in reassuring language, saying that the army came with peaceable intentions and kind feelings, that they would be secure in their persons, property, and religion, announcing that he had taken possession of all New Mexico for the United States, and that you are no longer Mexican subjects, you have become American citizens. I am your governor. Henceforth, look to me for protection. This address was received with general satisfaction, was replied to in fitting terms by Juan Bautista Vigil, who accepted the new sovereignty in the name of the people, and the governor then confirmed in their positions, most of the former officers administering to each of them the oath of allegiance to the United States. Fearing that there might be a concentration of Mexican troops to the south, General Kearny marched with 725 mounted men down the Rio Grande Valley as far as Tomé, being everywhere well received by the people and finding no enemies of any kind. On the 22nd of September, he established a regular civil government by the appointment of Charles Bent of Taos as governor, Donaciano Vigil as secretary, and Francis P. Blair as district attorney, together with judges and other officials. Governor Bent was an old resident, married to a New Mexican, and highly esteemed throughout the entire territory. Having thus provided for the government of the territory, General Kearny set out with his little army on September 26th for California as a wider field for his energy and administrative ability, leaving Colonel Doniphan in command. This latter officer had orders to march immediately to Chihuahua, where it was supposed that General Wool had arrived with a column from San Antonio. But just as he was starting, news arrived of an attack by Navajos on Polvidera, which induced a change of program, and an expedition against those Indians was determined on, so that the troops which had come across the plains in hostility to the Mexicans found their first active duty in their defense against their old enemies. This was a matter difficult to explain to the Indian mind, which considered that the Americans and themselves were both at war with the same enemies, but Colonel Doniphan finally succeeded in having a treaty made by which they agreed to cease from all depredations. This accomplished, he set out on his celebrated march to Chihuahua on December 14th, leaving the remaining troops in command of Colonel Sterling Price. Scarcely a day had passed after his departure before rumor became rife of an impending revolt by people of the territory. In judging of this, we are to remember that these people were Mexicans, that their mother country was at war with the United States, and that the American troops had invaded and practically conquered New Mexico, which was occupied by a portion of the army, so that from their point of view, it was an act of patriotism to attempt to drive from their soil these invaders of their country and restore it to its old position. The leaders in the contemplated revolt were Diego Archuleta, who had been a member of the Mexican Congress, and Tomas Ortiz, who had been in high command under Armijo, both men of large influence, and they were supported by many of the leading Mexicans of the north of the territory, and especially by two prominent priests, Padre Ortiz, the Vicario, and Padre Gallegos. The first general meeting was held on the 12th of December, when it was decided that the rising should take place 1 week from that day, when all Americans and all Mexicans who had consented to hold office under the American governor should be killed or driven out of the territory. Everything was carefully arranged, and the attempt might have been successful, but that by the advance of some timid spirits, the time of action was postponed until Christmas Eve. This delay was fatal to the project, for meanwhile information of the conspiracy was conveyed to the governor, who promptly arrested those suspected and took such measures as rendered the attempt abortive. Although thus quelled for a time, however, the spirit of revolt was far from destroyed, and suddenly developed itself in a most unexpected manner. Supposing all danger to be past, Governor Bent left Santa Fe on January 14th on a visit to his home in Taos, being accompanied by the sheriff and prefect of Taos County, the district attorney, and some others. On the night of the 19th, a large body of men, partly Mexicans and partly Pueblo Indians, attacked his residence and succeeded in killing not only the governor, but Sheriff Lee, Prefect Vigil, District Attorney Leal, Narciso Beaubien, a son of Judge Beaubien, and Pablo Yaramillo, a brother-in-law of the governor. At the same time, attacks were made on the Americans at the Arroyo Hondo and Rio Colorado above Taos, and at Mora, a number being killed at each place. The intention evidently was to have a general rising all over the territory as messengers came from Mora to Las Vegas bringing the news of the revolt and urging the people there to rise, but no action was taken there owing to the loyalty of the alcalde and the timely arrival of a few troops. The startling news of the assassination was swiftly carried to Santa Fe and reached Colonel Price the next day, quickly followed by tidings of the approach of a large Mexican and Indian force down the valley of the Rio Grande to attack the capital. The situation was extremely critical. Very few troops were in Santa Fe. In fact, the number remaining in the whole territory was very small, and they were scattered at Albuquerque, Las Vegas, and other distant points. Delay meant destruction, and Colonel Price lost no time in taking such measures as were possible with his limited resources. Orders were sent to Albuquerque for the 2 companies stationed there to come northward, and Price himself determined to march immediately to meet the insurgent army. All the force that he could muster was 310 men, including Captain Agne's company and a few other regular troops, and a volunteer company composed of nearly all the Americans in the city under command of Colonel Ceron Saint-Vrain, who happened to be in Santa Fe at the time. In this latter company were also Manuel Chavez, Nicolas Pino, and some other prominent New Mexicans who volunteered their services. They set out on January 23rd, nerved by the belief that there was no alternative but victory or annihilation. Scarcely had the little army passed Pojoaque when, in the narrow defile on the road, they met the advance guard of the Mexicans, and soon after found the main body drawn up on the high bank of the Santa Cruz River just east of the town of that name. They were commanded by General Montoya, aided by Generals Tafoya and Chavez. Here a fierce battle took place. The Mexican army was large but undisciplined and poorly provided with arms. They had, however, a great advantage in their position and in the occupancy of a number of adobe houses which were practically fortresses. Nevertheless, a vigorous charge in front and a flank attack by St. Vrain's volunteers, they were finally dislodged and forced to retreat, leaving 36 dead on the field, General Tafoya being among the number. At Los Luceros, the Americans were reinforced by the timely arrival of Captain Burgoyne's company of cavalry, which had hastened up from Albuquerque, and much encouraged thereby, they rapidly marched toward Taos. At Embudo, the Mexicans made another stand in a narrow canyon, but were forced to abandon it and retreated towards the north, finally concentrating at the pueblo of Taos, in the church of which, with walls from 3 to 6 feet thick, they fortified themselves, large numbers having deserted since the Battle of Santa Cruz, often called the Battle of La Cañada, and returned to their homes. Against this building, the Americans, as soon as they arrived, directed their attack, but cannonballs made little impression on the massive walls, in which they simply embedded themselves without doing any damage. So after 2 hours' bombardment, they withdrew towards evening to the Mexican town of Fernandez de Taos, 3 miles distant. Early the next morning, the attack was renewed, but was bravely met, and it was not until after a 7-hour struggle, in which the cannon were finally brought up within 60 yards of the church, and 1 or 2 unsuccessful attempts were made to carry it by storm, that the stronghold was taken, and then with a loss of a number of soldiers and of the gallant Captain Burgoyne, who was mortally wounded at the very wall. 150 of the insurgents were killed, and the next day the entire pueblo surrendered. This practically ended the revolt. General Montoya and 14 others were tried for the murder of Governor Bent and the others killed on January 19th, and were convicted and executed. Others were sentenced to be hung for treason, but the president properly pardoned them on the ground that no Mexican could be guilty of treason against the United States while war actually existed between the 2 countries. A few outbreaks occurred at isolated points soon afterward, but they seem to have been instigated rather for purposes of plunder than by any regular attempt to destroy the American authority, and later in the year the arrival in Santa Fe of large reinforcements made any future revolt futile. At the same time, the people began to see that they had really more freedom and better protection from the Indians under the American flag than that of Mexico. And finding that the stories circulated about the newcomers generally proved to be untrue, they gradually became reconciled to the change in government. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded all New Mexico to the United States, at the same time constituting all of its people except those who preferred formally to retain their Mexican citizenship, citizens of the United States, with the full rights and privileges belonging to that character, and thus the territory and its people became an integral part of the great American Republic.